Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards, the video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards in the board game Dominion. Today we're looking at Nobles. This is a 6-cost action and victory card from Intrigue, and it says choose one, +3 cards, or +2 actions, and then at the end of the game it is also worth 2 victory points. So Nobles is a generic engine component, so it can either be your terminal draw, or it can be a village, and it can be whichever one of those you need right now the most. So if you have 2 nobles in hand, obviously you can play one as draw, and you can play the other one as a village, and this is like the net effect of getting +1 card in your hand, like a single laboratory play across the 2 nobles. Because Nobles is such a good generic engine component, it's easy to add it to most draw engines to get some extra draw and reliability, and of course it also scores you points while doing that as well. So let's take a look at some of these a little bit more in depth. So first of all, I mentioned there that it gives you a little bit more reliability. How is this the case? So the challenge that terminal draw decks often present to you is the fact that you need to draw the villages and you need to draw the draw cards together, and ideally you want them earlier on in the shuffle in the right order. So there's all these like ordering problems. Well, because nobles can be either of these, the order in which you draw them matters a lot less. Like, say that you draw a bunch of terminal draw cards and then you have a nobles. Well, now it can be a village. And then later on, when you have more villages and there's no draw cards left in your hand, one of the nobles that you draw can then be your draw card instead. And of course, if you draw nobles together, then you play one of them as a village and the other one as draw, as you need to just get that bit further into your deck. So nobles, it's in the way that I explained in my laboratory video, the fact that ordering is less important means that there are more combinations of orders in which you can draw your cards and still be able to draw your deck. So that's nice part of Nobles. And because of this reliability and the fact that it gives 2 effects that you usually want in a draw engine, you can add Nobles to your deck very, very easily without causing problems in trying to support them, usually. If anything, they make drawing your deck just a little bit easier a lot of the time. Now, the problem is that Nobles is very expensive. At costing 6, that is a huge cost for a card. The sheer expense will make building and adding Nobles to your deck fairly slow. However, Nobles gives you points, and what this means is that it gives you a little bit more time to build the engine a bit more. So in a lot of, if you think of engine decks that are trying to like draw your deck and play something powerful compared to like, I don't know, some more like big money style deck, then big money decks will start to try gaining like 1 province a turn and gain a load of them over a number of turns, and maybe they won't hit it every turn, but they're going to try and slowly build up those points. Whereas an engine might try and build a lot and then get a load of points at once. Well, the problem is that if you leave your engine too long, eventually you just can't catch up in time. But if you're earning a bunch of points whilst you're building your engine, that gap is going to be less big, and that means that you can delay like setting off your engine and gumming it up with all the victory cards for a little bit later. And so that's really nice for the engines, because engines tend to gain in power more as they start running. So you start getting the engine like turning it on and drawing your whole deck, and then once you're actually at that stage, you can start adding more and more payload, and the deck just becomes more and more and more powerful with every turn where you get to keep building. Now, Nobles doesn't have to just give you these 2 options. You can also choose to play all of your Nobles as just one, and sometimes, Nobles will be the only card on the board that actually fulfills one of these functions. So what if Nobles is the only way to draw in your kingdom? Well, cards that are terminal +3 cards, these typically cost 5. Smithy is the exception, but it's just cheaper because it doesn't do anything else. So you can think of this as like a 5-cost terminal draw, but it's got a bonus of 2 points, and well, it's a little bit more expensive on top of that. Now 6 is meaningfully more expensive than 5, but it's not so much more expensive that it feels unreasonable compared to buying a 5-cost card, right? You might not get one in turns 3 and 4, for example, but soon you will be able to start adding nobles to your deck. And so it will take you slightly longer to get going if Nobles is your only terminal draw compared to other 5-cost terminal draw cards. But Nobles works perfectly well in this role, right? It's not quite as noticeable that the card is a lot more expensive. Now, as the only village, this is a very different case for Nobles. +2 actions with nothing else, no draw. That is absolutely atrocious for 6. If you think of Shantytown, that costs 3. And when you fail to draw with Shantytown, which is usually a lot of the time, right, you are just getting +2 actions and no draw. So that's half the cost for the same thing as 6. Now, yeah, it does give you the points, but that is a massive gap compared to a card effect that would normally cost like 5, right? So as the only village, Nobles is pretty bad. You play huge amounts, and it actively might stop you from drawing your deck, because the Nobles in these cases, you want to be playing them as a stop card, right? So you want to be adding in all these stop cards. Now, you can, if you draw a handful of Nobles, then it's not the end of the world if you want to play them as your only village, because you can sacrifice some of them to be draw as well. However, when you do that with Nobles, you are essentially giving up the village effect. So if you are hoping to draw your deck and then play a lot of terminal payload, and you're forced to spend some of the Nobles as draw when you wanted them to be villages, you are simply either not going to draw your deck as much, or you are going to have to give up on playing some of that terminal payload, and that can be a big problem. So, but of course, the village effect is still pretty strong overall, and it is still a village, and sometimes you really want that. So if the payload and the payoff for building the engine seems really, really big, you will still take Nobles as the only village, even though it's going to be quite slow to gain them, and it's not a very good village. So it will substantially slow down how long it takes to build your engine, and sometimes that can matter. If there is something that is particularly fast as an alternative strategy, like, I don't know, Workshop Gardens isn't that fast, but Courtyard, big money. Again, it's not super fast, but normally these sorts of 2 slower but reasonably decent strategies, they usually get crushed by a well-functioning engine. But if it takes a long time to build the engine, then even though you're earning a few points with Nobles, you can find that those strategies could actually win out. And it's the fact that the only village is Nobles that is actually the tipping point that means that you don't want to build the engine. As the only village, it tends to be nice if you had a way to draw your deck anyway, in order to use the Nobles as the village, because you don't really want to be... If you're using villages to use other terminal draw and the village doesn't draw very well, then it does become substantially harder to draw your deck. So if you have something else, like a whole stack of laboratories that you can gain somehow, like with Artisan or whatever, then using Nobles as your only village might be a slightly better prospect. Now, it's worth noticing, because it's a victory card, that the pile size will change, and it's different based on the number of players. There's only 8 of them in 2-player. However, the pile is larger than usual if you have more players than that. So most action cards only have 10 copies, but Nobles is different, because it's a victory card. Now, in 2-player, what this means is that this pile is slightly smaller than usual, and that can matter if you're using this as an important engine component, like if it's the only draw or the only village, because it just means that there's slightly less of them to go around, and that means that you might have to build a little bit less than you normally would compared to how you experience such boards normally. Like if you consider a normal board that only has 1 village pile in it, there's going to be some limit to how much you can build. But with Nobles, you might only get to build ever so slightly less than usual, so do keep that in mind. But also, losing the split becomes a little bit harsher with Nobles, because if there's only 8 of them and you lose the split, well, that means that you have at most 3 copies of Nobles, or probably even less. And that's really not many copies of one particular card. Like, normally if you can only get 3 copies of an important pile, then you lost the split really badly. But what's even worse with Nobles is that if you lose the split, and say you only lose it by 3-5, which is like the smallest amount you can lose the split by, you're down by 4 points, and that's more than a duchy. Now, 4 points actually really matters in this case, because if you're going to end up with a deck where both players are looking like they might split the provinces 4-4, then duchies become really important as like tiebreakers. But if buying a duchy isn't enough to actually overcome a tie, then that puts the player who's got the more nobles in a really strong position, because your opponent has to actually put in quite a lot more work just to catch up with you. Like if you can't even buy a duchy, then you have to buy 2 duchies. Well, that's much, much harder to get 2 extra duchies than it is to just get 1 in these sorts of situations. So nobles can sometimes become a very important pile in a number of games. If they seem like they might be important, winning that split isn't only going to get you a reasonable number of cards and leave your opponent with barely any compared to normal, but you also get this pretty reasonable points advantage. So, you do see nobles become quite important sometimes as a result of that. Now, this card does, of course, cost 6, which is really expensive, and it's a card that we usually want many copies of. So the other 6-cost cards that we've seen, Artisan and Harem, not normally cards that you want that many copies of, but Nobles is the first exception we've seen of a really expensive card that we want as many as we can get. So if you can find some way to not pay that 6-cost card, that's going to be very, very helpful. And there's a lot of ways to gain cards that cost 4 or less, and there's some, like for example Artisan, to gain cards that cost 5, but gaining cards that cost 6 is much less frequent. You will not see that anywhere nearly as much in Kingdoms. Now, of course, cost reduction, like all cards, works pretty well in being able to lower these expensive cards down to the gain cost. So if you're able to play like 2 bridges, now you can start picking up nobles with your more traditional gainers like Workshop and Ironworks. I wanted to just call out Ferry as a particularly powerful example because it reduces the cost of a pile by 2, and that immediately plonks nobles down into the 4 range, where you are much more likely to be able to start gaining it directly. So if you can gain nobles with, say, Ironworks, then that's really strong, right? Because it's an action victory dual type, so it'll be giving you the action and the plus card bonus from the Ironworks. But in general, just because nobles is such a good card that you want generally, like these gainers start to become really good if you can get the cost reduction and start picking up some nobles with them. Now, the fact that Nobles is a victory card is actually not helpful in gaining it in some cases. So here are 3 examples of cards that can sometimes gain you cards that cost 6, or really expensive ones, but Nobles doesn't really work with them. So Horn of Plenty is very good high-cost gainer. It's not actually that hard in a lot of cases to let Horn of Plenty gain you 6 costs. But it does say at the end of the card, if it's a victory card, trash this. So if you try and gain a Nobles with Horn of Plenty, you actually lose the Horn of Plenty, which is usually pretty bad. So you just can't gain Nobles with Horn of Plenty. And then there's Haggler, which literally says non-victory card on it. So Haggler cannot gain nobles as a bonus. So normally with Haggler, you're buying like provinces and then you're trying to get some nice other 6-cost cards. It's like gold or just whatever expense that you can. But it just cannot take nobles as a bonus. Now, you can just buy the nobles directly and then gain like 5-cost cards. So I'm not saying Haggler is bad, but the fact that you can't pick up nobles as a bonus when buying provinces is kind of a shame. And lastly, Jester. It's a bit random, but sometimes it's nice to gain these expensive cards. But with Jester, if it's a victory card, they gain a curse, and they get no option to actually start picking up the nobles yourself. So it's still going to curse your opponent, but, Jester isn't a way to gain those expensive cards that sometimes you rely on, and that makes Jester really good. It will work with other 6 costs, just not with nobles. And lastly, if a gainer does just let you to gain 6-cost cards directly, then they do get quite powerful when nobles is available, and that's because these sorts of cards you're usually trying to build an engine anyway, and because nobles is such a good engine card, you are happy to just gain as many nobles as you can and also gain a lot of points. So I've got 2 examples here, Lurker and Smugglers. These are 2 gainers that basically can just gain really expensive action cards or 6 costs just directly. So I've talked about Lurker, we've got a video on it, and Smugglers, obviously, is Seaside, we're going to go through Seaside after Intrigue. So we'll get around to Smugglers at some point, talking about that. Now let's talk about Remodel. So Remodel really likes 6 cost cards, because with Remodel you can turn the 6 cost cards directly into provinces. So one of the things with Remodel and its variants is that sometimes you don't necessarily get the opportunity to buy lots of 6 cost cards. So you might have a pretty good draw engine, but you basically never really got around to buying any golds, and now it's time to start provincing. And it's a little bit sad for Remodel in those cases, because you don't get to start like turning spare 6 cost cards, like golds, into provinces. However, because Nobles is a useful engine component, you're probably more likely to have picked a bunch of them up, and that means that you have a lot of these 6 cost cards in your deck that you can deal with. Like sometimes you just don't want to buy a lot of golds, so you won't have them. But with Nobles, you might just have a bunch, and that means you get these opportunities to suddenly start gaining extra provinces. Now, of course, because Nobles is worth points, you're only gaining 4 victory points when you turn it into a province, compared to if you turned a gold into a province, where that's a 6 victory points difference. But bear in mind that gaining a lot of provinces really fast is still very strong. Like, even if you're gaining less points, gaining multiple provinces per turn is still very strong and puts you in a very good position. So Nobles is pretty good in when there are good remodelers available. I guess it's worth noting that with Replace, which is also an Intrigue, you start giving your opponents curses if you're able to remodel like a 4 cost into a Nobles. So there's just a little bonus there. You can, of course, that means you can use like Ironworks to gain a 4 cost card, remodel or replace into Nobles. You're giving out curses and you're getting a good engine point as well. So remodelers, I think they tend to be nicer when you have Nobles around. Some other benefits to the fact that Nobles is a victory card. We've gone through this in other videos, but some cards actually interact in positive ways with cards that are victory cards. So Patrol, for example, will look at the next 4 cards in your deck and draw all of the victory cards. So Nobles being a village and Patrol being terminal draw, well, Nobles works really well with Patrol, right? You get to put the Nobles, reach further into your deck and draw them into your hand, and then you have more villages in your hand to use with like other patrols that you may have. So that's pretty nice. Now, I don't really want to go too much into this. I've talked in the Harem and the Mill videos about the sorts of cards that give you bonuses with other victory cards, so I figure you can just look at those videos if you want to know a little bit more. I don't feel the need to repeat myself again just for the Nobles video, so do check those videos out if you want to know a little bit more about this. And some last final points about Nobles. So hopefully this was obvious, but when you are deciding what order to play the cards in your hands, you should probably play the Nobles as late as possible. That way you get more opportunities to see which of the cards or actions you need at the time. So instead of just guessing early and then picking wrong and no longer being able to draw your deck, just wait and leave the Nobles until later on. Like all terminal draw, but also it's the case for non-drawing villages, if you don't have that many action cards, you can end up with situations where you like draw a single Nobles and you don't really want to play it, either because you're going to play it with dead draw and you think you might draw some action cards that you can't play because it was your last action, or because it's a non-drawing village, just 1 Nobles on its own, or like with 1 other terminal non-drawing card. You know, the Nobles isn't really doing anything for you. Like you've drawn it with, I don't know, a workshop and you'd rather play the workshop this turn. Well, a Nobles and a workshop in your hand and then a bunch of treasures. The Nobles just isn't doing anything. So you will see that happen sometimes, but that's fine. Like, trust the engine. If you keep building and you keep adding Nobles, that's going to stop being a problem and then your deck's going to be in a pretty good situation. So I guess I've talked about it in terms of a non-drawing village in the Shantytown video, so you should check that out if you want to know a little bit more. Okay, so that's kind of it for Nobles. It's just a very good general engine component. If you're building a good engine anyway, then Nobles is really nice to try and add in. So what we're going to do is head over to the online client, and we're going to generate some random boards that have Nobles in it, and we're going to consider how good Nobles is in those kingdoms. So here we have trashing with Masquerade and Trading Post. We have Throne Room and Nobles as villages. And there's also Diplomat as a village as well. Is Diplomat any good as a village? Well, we've got Torturer that seems very strong here. I would like to play as many Torturers as I can. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to be opening with Masquerade. And what would I want with the Masquerade? I might just get a silver because I really want to start. Do I want to get Torturers straight away? I mean, Masquerade and a bunch of Torturers in my deck isn't so great early on. I need to sort of get my deck going. Like, do you just open double Masquerade? I mean, surely not, right? Diplomat will start being good at some point. You're going to start getting multiple Torturer plays, and it's not that hard to start your turn with a Diplomat and 4 cards. When you have Torturer, there's also the opportunity to start with a bigger hand size and then gain a bunch of curses and then play Diplomat a bunch. I think I would like 2 Masquerades eventually because I'm going to start getting some curses from Torturer at some point. So I don't think I open double Masquerade. Is Nobles good here? I think it is. I know we've got Throne Room, but Throne Room is going to be hard to use non-terminally unless I start getting some Merchants. But Merchant's all right. I think I open Masquerade. Silver, I guess. I'm just worried about drawing Baron dead. Baron is okay. It's the only plus buy. We actually are going to want one at some point. So Masquerade Baron is a fine opening. If I open 5-2, I'll probably get Trading Post just because I opened 5-2 and I want to start trashing. I'll be pretty sad. I think the 3-4 opening is better. But yeah, I'm going to pick up Nobles at some point. It's fine to have an engine that's Torturer and Nobles as the bulk of drawing your deck, because Throne Room's pretty nice. You can draw a little bit better with that. If you throne a Nobles, you can pick it for actions, and then you can play it for cards. So yeah, that just makes it a little bit easier to get going when you've got Nobles. So I do want them, but I need to get the deck under control and really want to focus on drawing the engines first. So Nobles is an important card here. I think it's more important to focus on the Torturers first, but once you've got a regular Torturer engine going, and maybe I'll just be using Throne Room with Merchant for villages then I'm going to want to get as many Nobles as I can. Torturer is going to give the engine a lot of time to build, and Nobles is going to give it even more time to build, and you sort of can't really beat that. There's nothing to do with Gardens as a way to get faster than that. So yeah, so Nobles is pretty good on this board, but it's mostly defined by Torturer, I think, that board. It seemed pretty strong on that board, Torturer does. Here we have Steward as a strong trasher. We got Trading Post. It seems slightly similar as the other board. What's interesting here is that the only draw is Nobles, Diplomat, and Moat. These are the only draw cards. Then they don't seem super great as draw. We do have Conspirator as an excellent way to gain a lot of money. This is a pretty good payload card. I think we open with Steward and we trash down. I don't think I actually want any Moats. It's not a very good draw card. With Festival as another village, I think I want Nobles as my main draw card here. Diplomat isn't really going to be of any use. Yeah, not really. I do want Nobles for the draw then, so I'm going to open with Steward to trash, and do I open with Mill alongside it? Or would I be happier with a Conspirator? I think I'm okay with Mill, and I'm going to use my first 5 to get a Festival, and then as I start trashing down and I have some Festivals, I can start getting Conspirators and Nobles, and because I've got a bunch of Festivals for my money, eventually I'm going to have a draw deck, and it's going to be able to draw a bunch of Conspirators and play every turn. I don't really need Baron because I've got Festivals, and soon enough I'll have a big dollop of money, and because I'll have some draw with Nobles and Festival, I can probably get away with just having a few more mills in my deck and start discarding on some turns for a bit more money. I think I can only draw so far The draw is not that brilliant here. There's not actually that many reasonable draw cards because the other ones only draw 2. Steward, Moat and Diplomat, they're all just +2 cards. And that's not great when your main villages are Festival and Nobles. So I really need Nobles for the draw. So I think Nobles is very important here, actually. It's going to be a while till you get your first one, but once you've got it, you're going to do pretty well. I don't think Duke is going to be able to hold up compared to the engine with Nobles. With Conspirator and like Festival, you are going to get a lot of money very quickly, and provinces are going to empty super fast once the engine gets going. And there's Nobles for extra points, and there's Mill for extra points for the engine. So, I mean, Mill's decent with Duke, but, you know, I think Nobles is a very important card on this board. And the engine's going to do very well, and the points from Nobles are going to help too. Nobles is a pretty good card overall, I would say, so I expect it's going to do pretty well in a bunch of these kingdoms. Well, straight away my eye is drawn to Chapel, as always, when it shows up. There is Festival, there is Laboratory, there is Nobles, there is Council Room, we have Villages, we have Draw. The only thing with this kingdom is that what's the payload? Festival gives us money. There is Mill that can help. There is Vassal. So we can get really thin and we can just Vassal Markets and Nobles a bunch. That's fine with Vassal. We have Festival, so it's really easy to just buy a whole bunch of Vassals. Similarly with Market. So yeah, I think we open Chapel and... what do we open with Chapel? A Mill, probably, just so that they don't collide, and we might be able to pick up a nice early 5, and I'd want a Festival as my first 5, just for the extra money. Be nice to avoid adding any silvers into the deck, if possible. And then eventually we just start buying a load of engine components. We are going to want Nobles, but we're fine to pick up Laboratories earlier on. How many Nobles do we need? We have to pair up each Nobles with like a Festival, because we don't really have super great villages, but we are going to want... I think I'd like Laboratory as slightly better draw. We're just going to try and gain a load of Vassals and play a load by just cramming our deck full of action cards. I know there is Secret Passage to help really make the Vassals very reliable, but there's no easy way to just amass a lot of Secret Passages. They feel like a bit of a waste of money, because there are just much better cards. You want to be buying like Vassals than Mills. So yeah, after spending a bit of time chapeling, we should start to get our deck under control with Festivals, with Markets. We're going to add some Nobles. I don't think it's the most important pile here. You know, I think buying a Festival and a Nobles is not necessarily as good as just buying a Festival and a Laboratory, or like a Festival and a Market. I think our draw is going to be pretty tightly controlled on this board. We won't be overdrawing by that much early on. We just want to be adding a load of money, because we can get a load of payload very, very quickly. But I think I will have some Nobles, but it's only okay on this board. There are lots of better stuff. We can only buy things, and buying them is quite expensive, and there's a bunch of stuff we'd rather be getting at 5 and 3. But, you know, it's okay on that board. Here we can trash down with Sentry. There is Swindler that can turn Nobles into Golds, I notice, but maybe that's not the worst thing ever. Let's focus a bit more. So we have Workshop and Ironworks, but there's not that many things to gain that cost 4 or less, so that's a little bit sad. So the low-cost cards are not super good here. We do want to trash down with Sentry, because what is there to do once we've trashed down? I noticed that Nobles is the only village. But, you know, we have got Market, we have got Minion, we have got Diplomat, so there actually are lots of non-terminals. There's even Courtier, which like you can use in a Minion deck for a bunch of money, +1 action, 3 gold. I think Minion seems really good here, actually. It's a bit annoying that there's Swindler that's going to try and swindle all your minions into Courtiers or something. Just not very good 5 costs. But I think we can do it. I think we can get thin with Sentry. We can build up, and it's worth doing. I think we actually will have some Nobles. They're fine to play as a village. Might mean you can get away with playing Courtier as something else, rather than plus action now and then. Or just use it to play more Swindlers. Actually, I think Swindler's going to be very strong on this deck. I think Swindler wrecks stuff, so what we really want to be doing is thinning down and then trying to play as many swindlers as possible. And to do that, we are going to need nobles as villages. The fact that they don't draw is not great. I mean, minion means it makes it feel like it's not so bad, but it is actually getting in the way of your draw. But I think we can do it. Now, that is a lot of very expensive cards that we want to buy. We want courtiers, we want minions, we want markets, we want sentries, we want nobles. They are all very expensive. But what is anyone else going to do? Swindlers are going to cause big problems. You can chop silvers into workshops if they try and go money. Eventually they'll get provinces and golds, and that's fine with Swindler, but you're going to turn a lot of coppers into curses if you start. You're definitely opening Swindler here. I actually think I'm opening Swindler Silver because I really want to maximise my chance of hitting 5, get a sentry early, thin down, go for a big minion stack. And I think, money cannot compete if it keeps dropping to 4-card hands and then getting a load of coppers swindled. It's just going to have a real tough time. So you have to do it. You just have to go for the expensive, buying a lot of 5 costs. And I think that'll do well. Nobles helps a little bit. It's okay. It helps you play more swindlers. But then again, so does Diplomat. Honestly, Nobles isn't that exciting here. I think it's a little bit too expensive. I actually like Minion with Diplomat, using a Diplomat to get a village. It'll only work sometimes. So I think I will get some Nobles. But Courtier also shrinks my hand size if I'm drawing a bunch with Diplomat. So, it's maybe I don't need Nobles here. It's not the best going for Nobles because we've got another form of draw, and we don't actually need the villages that much. In reality, a lot of the cards we want to play are all non-terminal. So, we just want to focus on buying a load of 5 costs instead. So here's the last kingdom. I know we have Patrol. I spot in my eye. That usually goes pretty well with Nobles. We also have Bridge, so it might be somewhat easier. We've got a Workshop as well. So, unfortunately, Nobles is the only village. So this is the big problem with this board. We have Steward and Sentry and Upgrade, all for trashing. We have Smithy as another draw. But we do have Lurker, and Lurker can help you get Nobles. So what's the plan here? The lack of villages is a big problem. However, with Steward for trashing and Lurker as a nice 2-cost that we can buy on the turns that we trash down, Lurker's going to be pretty good here. And the fact that it gains Nobles is really good. In fact, I think the fact that you can gain Nobles, does that mean that we ignore Minion? Especially because there's Patrol to make. If we can get a load of Nobles and then start buying some Patrols, we might be able to draw really well. I would really ideally like to be playing a bunch of Bridges. I actually don't think I'd get a Workshop here, even with Bridge. It would be nice to play a lot of Bridges, but actions seem a little bit too difficult here to do very well out of Bridge. So, what's the alternative? The other alternative is that it's like a minion stack with some nobles in it. Maybe you can get away with playing the nobles for +2 actions if you are using minion for draw, and that's because it's drawing you 4 cards and it's doing it non-terminally. So that actually might be a little bit better than Patrol, because Patrol is eating up your spare actions and you just want to be playing a bunch of Bridges. I guess the only problem is that if we're using minion for draw, the Bridges aren't enough to actually get up to province. We're going to need some treasures, but we can't actually guarantee they are in our hand with minion. So I think we actually... Well, you get some money from spare minions if you can get enough of them. And once the nobles are gone, we can use our lurkers to get a lot of minions. So maybe that's okay. Or maybe we just get a mixture of stuff. Maybe we will have minions, but we will also add a patrol or 2. I don't know. I could actually see that, even though that's very unorthodox, just because you want to try and grab a bunch more nobles. Upgrade doesn't feel very good here, to be honest, because we've got Steward for trashing. I think we try and play Bridges, but I think what I want to do actually is just gain... trash down with Steward, get lurkers, pick up nobles and minions, and Bridges, and then we're just going to cycle through our deck, use lurkers to gain a bunch of stuff, and then eventually we're just going to have some Bridges and some money, and we're going to try and climb up to province that way. I think discarding our opponent's hand down to 4 constantly is going to give them a bad time if they don't also go for minions. So I think you sort of kind of have to do minion, actually. Random 4-cost card could be a problem, especially if your village, like if you try and go patrol and nobles, the fact that nobles do not draw means with a 4-card hand, you could end up not having any patrols in your hand pretty often, I think. So yeah, I think nobles is good here. I think we want as many of them as we can get, because if we can win the split pretty significantly, then we're in a very strong position with bridge. If we can get 5 nobles, we could technically play like 5 bridges or 6 with that, and that's just going to crush our opponent who can't do that. So yeah, I think nobles split is actually very important here, thinking about it. The points matter. Piles are going to get low. We're going to have a bunch of lurkers. We're going to drain nobles. We're going to drain minions. We're going to have some bridges. Having a points lead and also being able to play more bridges just puts us in a really strong position. So yeah, I think I'm convinced nobles pretty good on this kingdom. So there you go. That was nobles. It was pretty good a lot of the time on a lot of those boards, except for the one where we didn't really need the actions or the card draw from it. Yeah, nobles, it's a good card. It's very expensive, though, is the only problem. Anyway, I hope that was useful for you. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.